so glad you're here. I'm Chingy Chen. I'm faculty in the Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell. I'm really excited to hear from our guest speakers, Misha Cardenas and Percy Lazard, and our conversation holder, Hex, this afternoon as part of our Imagining Trans Futures Cross-Disciplinary Research Cluster, which is organized with my colleague, Neil Simpkins, with support from our graduate assistant, Whitney Fraley, who will be our tech and access needs support person today, and with also support from our graduate peer facilitator, Madison Gaines, who will be in the Labor Stories classroom with the students who are in person in the Labor Stories class. Also, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the UW Bothell Labor Colloquium and the Labor Stories During Pandemic Times class, and then also from the Convergent Zone reading series from our MFA program. Before we get started, we're going to ask everyone to please stay muted during the talk. And if there's a lot of background noise, we may mute you directly. If you have any tech or access needs, please feel free to message Whitney. And I think Whitney renamed themselves as tech support, so you could find them more easily. Or you can message me or Neil about your access needs, not our guest speakers. And just so you know that this talk will be recorded and available at a later date in the Imagining Trans Futures archives. And then after the talk, we're going to open up to a bit of conversation with the audience, which Hex will curate. And we're going to ask you to send your questions in a direct chat to Whitney for consideration during the event. And the chat right now is only going to go to the hosts and co-hosts. And because of time constraints, we may not get to all your questions, but I'm sure Hex will lead us in a lively conversation. We're zooming from different places, but this event is hosted by UW Bothell, which was built upon the unceded homeland of the Willow Sammamish people. Our campus also touches on the shared waters of tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. In addition, this place has been shaped by the labor of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino laborers who built rail lines and worked in crop fields, logging camps, and salmon canneries, and African-American workers who worked in shipyards. What this means for me as an educator and writer living in the region is to commit to learning about the history and culture of these communities, to show solidarity for the continued fight for Indigenous sovereignty, and to work on decolonizing our educational practices, including whose histories, stories, and lineages we center in our writing practices and education. And I hope that engaging with the work that the writers, artists, and thinkers who are sharing their work with us today is one contribution to this effort. And I encourage our audience to consider how you can individually and communally contribute to this work in a meaningful way to you. With that, I'm excited to pass the mic to Hex, who will introduce our speakers for today. Thank you so much, Hex.
Hi, everybody. I'm Hex, or Hex FA. I guess I should introduce myself a little bit real quick. I'm a mix of Lakota and European trans masculine person who makes digital interactive narrative games and arts and things. I am currently this is a little like self-bump here. I'm currently curating an art show of Indigenous, specifically gender and transgender digital artists. So please contact me later if that is something that you are into. And I'm going to introduce our speakers today, who are both amazing. So we have Misha Cardenas, who is an assistant professor of performance plan design, critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she directs the Critical Reality Studio. Recently, Cardenas wrote a really cool book, Poetic Operations, and proposes algorithmic analysis as a method for developing trans of color. Misha makes games that are right up my alley. So I played like Shift and Photo Metal Misha. It was really cool, and I'm super excited that you're here. And we also have Percy Lazard. So hi, Percy. Thanks for being here as well. Percy is a two-spirit trans disabled thinker and registered member of the Penticton First Nations. They have 37 years experience helping as a social worker and over 25 years as a CPR. They currently hold tenure track position and serve as chair of the Indigenous Studies program at Wilfrid Laurier University. And I just want to say personally, work is so important to myself as well as a community harm reduction worker and to Indigenous communities in general. So I'm super happy that you're here as well. And yeah, I'm gonna hand it over to y'all now to do a cool thing.
I'm assuming I unmute myself, correct? I'm having a hard time on my end. I'm having a hard time hearing you, Hex. Like I get that.
I'm so sorry.
Issues. And then, like I really need you to use your outdoor voice as someone who's hard of hearing.
But yes, please continue, Percy. You're up.
Okay, yeah. So I came up in a time when I shared the stage and microphone with the likes of Christos, Beth Grant, Joy Harjo, Connie Fife, Coley Driscoll, Daniel Heath Justice, and Sarah Hunt. I'll never be a Billy Ray Bell Carter, Joshua Whitehead. I don't need to. I can only be Percy Lazard and Teachin, which in my language is firekeeper, wolf, and I'm a firekeeper. Those are some of my responsibilities. I was displaced as a newborn child until I aged out at 18 years of age in the Ministry of Child and Family Services as a Scoop Indigenous child. I was also displaced from reserves due to colonialism and pushed out of many institutions for being direct and centering the land, community, and critical reflexivity. I believe some of the work that you folks have read was a document that I was the lead writer on. Much of my creative work has led to that document, the 2S LGBT 2 sub-working group, MMIW G2S final report. And all that work has led me to continually respond and react from a place of surviving or in opposition to colonialism. What does that mean? When we talk about an intersectional approach to identities and subject positionality, I've constantly had to maneuver, duck and weave when it came to being in different spaces and places and having to constantly push back against whiteness and white supremacy. And if anything, it's a loving reminder. It's Indigenous creatives who have reminded us of a way forward to reach a future that we reimagine. So yeah, it's their text, visuals, photos, and words that continue to echo and shake the core of white supremacy and pinkwashing. One thing that I've also had to come across or constantly push against in these ways of creativity and expression is exceptionalism. In that there can only be one. There can only be one Indigenous person, one trans person, one two-spirit person, because let's not conflate sexuality with gender, folks, and disabled person. And if you are that person, then everybody else behind you has to meet the bar by said institutions, whether it's the academic, industrial complex, nonprofits, or creative worlds, right? Because let's see who's being published and who's not, right? So one of the things that has comforted me in all of this process of maneuvering, ducking and weaving, and coming up against exceptionalism, push out, ongoing neo-colonialism, is the surge and notion by Indigenous thinkers, scholars, and creatives of relationality, whether it be ethical, radical, or simply connections. And so folks might be asking, well, what is racial relationality? It's relationships that people have. We've had our relatives here acknowledge the lands with which they are from. So I want to acknowledge that I am an uninvited guest to the Hawaiian island of Maui, and the people here who continue to be displaced by entitled tourist turds like me. right? Which I also come from as a representative of the Wilfrid Laurier University, where I am an invited guest with upholding the Dish with One Spoon Treaty with the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Cree, and the Three Fire Confederacy. So relationships, in terms of relationality, moves beyond land acknowledgements and really is about reflecting on what are you doing when nobody's looking, right? So circling back to the report, in the ways in which I've already identified the ways I've been complicit, even I, as the lead writer, which that document is the first of its kind. Shared the voices of our relatives to the north, the Inuit folks. It shared the very lived real experiences of trans sex workers or formerly trafficked folks. It shared the voices of Two-Spirit folks, and not the handful of cis Two-Spirit folks that we see speaking on a wide variety of issues. So it was able to bring to center their experiences of being missing and murdered, and the additional layer of colonialism when folks identify us, our chosen family identify us as missing and or murdered, and when our bio families, as a result of colonialism and being indoctrinated by the churches through the 126 years phenomenon of the Indian residential school of Christianity and organized religions and Catholicism, by even in death, we don't get to live our real lives as Two-Spirit trans folks when we are dead named, we're misgendered, and we're clothed through funeral protocol, not in how we lived our lives in the worlds. So all of this continues to remind me, starting by sharing the stage with Christos Beth Brandt, Joy Harjo, Connie Fife, Coley Driscoll, Delny Youth Justice, and Sarah Hunt, about all the voices that were missing. Not only did we exclude voices and not center Black, Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous folks in the phenomenon and epidemic that's impacting folks in the context of Canada around missing and murdered, but it also had me look up and see the conversations that we're having nationally and globally, and in Two-Spirit and trans communities, which led me to, with the infrastructural support of a settler university, create a speaker series where 31 relatives nationally and globally from the South Pacific, from the land, community, a nonprofit industrial complex to the academy, speak on a variety of issues. I felt it necessary to center these voices, young folks, disabled folks, Black folks, Afro-Indigenous folks, because my definition of indigeneity includes Black folks. So we were able to have that series, again, the first of its kind, because I wanted to decenter what people are doing when asking Two-Spirit or trans folks to come forward and speak on issues of exceptionalism, to actually broaden and celebrate and honor and nuance the many different approaches that my community members could speak on. What has this led to? Well, it's led to relationships with folks across Canada and here, right? With one of the folks here who had already been introduced and introduced themselves to come and speak with you folks and share some of the ways in which Two-Spirit people moving forward, trans Indigenous people moving forward can reimagine another future possible. And it also has led to connections to people in the South Pacific. One thing about the Academy, it wants you to show what you can do to make it look good. So I've been approved to go on research leave to spend 6 months in the South Pacific and supporting my Indigenous relatives there. With that document, food, laughter, necessary critical conversations, and supporting them and their experiences of gender-based violence in the 2S LGBTQIA communities. What else? So yeah, so all of those things are connected because it's always in a response, because the future I imagine is that in Indigenous studies, that foundational texts actually include Two-Spirit and trans folks, that the creatives actually include the diversity of 2S LGBTQIA folks. And in my own discipline, because I'm a formally trained social worker, that those don't just position 2S LGBTQIA folks as a problem or an issue that needs to be fixed or saved, right? So those are the things that I am constantly pushing back against, that I am constantly trying to bring to the center, and that I am also trying to get space from in terms of our Black thinkers, Black femmes who through much violence against them as parents, life givers of their children's being killed in streets, wanted to be seen more than trauma porn, right? I don't want a 2S LGBT identity to be associated with all the things wrong with the community, because like Dr. Mara Laramie in 1990, who gave birth out of ceremony at the 3rd Annual International Two-Spirit Gathering held in Winnipeg in the summer, was able to say, this is what Creator God, Allah Buddha, higher power, gifted us with, because we are not descendants of lesbos, right? In terms of lesbians. Here is a word that we can conceptually be part of, and that we can share it with our relatives. And the good thing about that is that that seemed like it gave permission for Indigenous folks to ask their own relatives, what is the word for who we are in our languages? Let's decolonize, let's heal, let's reconnect, because without a culture and language, who are we? Let's stop disappearing 2S LGBTQI folks from our own peoples as scale. So I then took that upon myself to challenge the language speakers. Who were we in the past? And they're able to share Stamia. And who was I as a gender diverse person? Menimcheeks. So there is a name for me in my people. There is a place for me. And that's a way to stop hetero painting me, meaning everything that came after Colombozo turned right instead of left and introduced the doctrine of discovery, right? It is a reminder that we were here, and what was brought over on those 3 boats was homophobia, cissexism, transphobia, right? And micro and macroaggressions. But that actually we as Menimcheoks and Stamia were gifts. And it's one thing as well that a relative, there's a Cutland, was able to push back, okay, I'm not an Anishinaabe. That doesn't fit for me. Hence giving birth and sharing a concept of indigiqueer. And that again, is the creatives, it's the artists who are showing us and reimagining another future is possible. Because without it, we would not have land back. Without it, we would not have land and water defenders, reminding us that without the land, we are nothing. Without fresh water, we are not able to sustain ourselves. All of us, right? So yeah, so those are just some of the things that I am wanting to move through and with, and it's through the directions of young folks and the land, and being an invited guest, or building relationships on Indigenous people land to transition from being uninvited to an invited. So yeah, I'll turn it over to my colleague, my relative, to take you on another journey. And I look forward to questions. I know I might have shared some things that have left unanswered, and I welcome those in a spirit of kinship. To expand our knowledge base, to expand what you're understanding, what it means to be Indigenous, to LGBTQIA, or in my language, Stamyar Menimcheoks. And with that, I'll turn my camera and my mic off.
Thank you so much, Percy. Passing the mic to Misha.
Thank you so much, Shingy. And thanks for organizing, and thanks to all the organizers, and thanks to Whitney for doing tech support. And it's so wonderful to see old friends. Thanks for being here, Amaranth and Penelope. And yeah, it's really nice. And thanks to my students in Queer and Trans Games for showing up early for this Zoom event that is going to suffice for our class today. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about Poetic Operations, my recent book that came out in March. And going to give you an overview of the book and then read an excerpt. I think I have 20 minutes, right? Let me set a timer. Okay. I want to acknowledge that the land that I'm speaking to you from is the unceded territory of the Awaswa speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. So this land acknowledgement, written with the Amamutsun tribe and in collaboration with folks at UCSC, is just a starting place, but it's not like one to just make and move on. Decolonization is a major part of the context for the book, thinking about decolonizing transgender studies, decolonizing our understanding of race and gender and how those two things interact, and decolonizing algorithms. So Poetic Operations, Trans of Color Art and Digital Media. It's dedicated to May and Judy and chosen families everywhere. May was my foster daughter for 9 months, but now she lives in Texas with her uncle. And Judy is my mom, who passed away in 2020. And chosen families everywhere are really important to me, how I'm getting through. So I start the book talking about this travesti artist from Peru, Giuseppe Camposano, and thinking about visibility for trans people is not enough. Thinking about how in 2014, when we saw the supposed transgender tipping point, the result was actually much more violence. That in 2014, the number of murders of trans people went up by 50% and continues to go up year after year. So facing that conundrum and facing the real lack of other trans of color scholarship that was being shown in academia, I started writing this book. I do like to point out to people that I went through a lot of years of grad school, like 8 years of grad school, and nobody ever once assigned a book by a trans woman for me to read. It wasn't until I put my bibliography together for my qualifying exams that I started reading books by trans women. And I wanted to change that for other people. So I wrote about a lot of trans people of color in this book. So this work by Camposano, DNI, or De Natura Incertis, Camposano manufactured a national identity card, which is like a real ID or a passport, and made it to be a lenticular print. So like a trading card or like a 7-Eleven cup, that when you look at it from different angles, the image shifts and the sex marker on it shifts from M to T. And I started with this for us to think in a more complex way about trans of color visibility, and think about how visibility is not enough, but it's important for us to have other kinds of visibility for us to be able to shift our visibility. And a main strategy of mine in the book is to uplift the existing strategies of trans people of color, and highlight the brilliance of trans of color artists in different works. So I talk about a number of Giuseppe's works, including the Museo Travesti del Peru, or the Transvestite Museum of Peru, which is an imaginary museum. And I also write about a number of my works in the book, So local autonomy networks, or AutoNets for short, was a series of so local autonomy networks was a series of works that I made, starting with this wearable electronic garments. I was thinking about ways of creating safety for myself and communities that I feel a part of for other queer and trans people of color. And so I made these garments designed so that if you needed help, you could press a button on your hoodie or dress or bracelet, and it would send out a wireless signal to anyone else in the network who had another one of these garments that I made. And then we use those as sort of conversation starters, as prototypes to think about what would be safety strategies that we could make that would be embodied strategies, and to have real conversations, which I think was the most important part, about how to keep each other safe, because we can't rely on the police. So what are abolitionist safety strategies? And I also talked about a number of games in the book. I was inspired by Maddie Bryce's game, My Nietzsche, which we've talked about extensively in my class this quarter. Really beautiful, small, very personal game about being a Black trans woman. You're this little pixel avatar there, and waking up in the morning, trying to go get coffee with a friend and avoid violence. Maddie Bryce also made a really important follow-up to this game called Empathy Machine, because she was so disappointed by the way it was used again and again, and to supposedly create empathy for trans people, which she thought was not what she was trying to do. So she made an embodied piece, follow-up performance piece, in which her body became the game controller. I also talk about this two-spirit artist, and I'm going to read a section of the book about Raven Wings, who's the person in the center. Raven Wings is a two-spirit Mohawk performance artist, dance artist, who was my dance teacher for 2 years, and who we collaborated on a number of, oh, I'm doing the leaning forward thing. Leaning back now. We collaborated on a number of works, and in particular, I made this game called Redshift and Portal Metal, which was trying to tell complex stories about trans people of color, thinking about my experience of moving to Toronto and how I may be implicated in colonialism, how could I be working for decolonization while I was actively settling in that place? Again, I took that video game. It's a web-based game you can play online for free, and did performances and workshops with it in a number of different cities, including Toronto. And in the performance in Toronto, Raven performed with me in that performance and did a solo piece there. I think I will. So I talk about these works in the book in order to articulate trans of color poetics. So when I started the book, we were reading a lot of queer of color critique. And in 2013, as a graduate student, as a PhD student, I was looking around saying, where's the trans of color critique? There was none that was presented to me. There was some articles in Transgender Studies Reader 2, like Trans Necropolitics was a good early important example. But it wasn't until 2014 and later, much later, that Marcia Ochoa's book, Queen for a Day, came out, and Riley Norton's book, Black on Both Sides, and John Chen's book, Trans Exploits. And now there's a whole field of trans of color studies, which is beautiful and amazing and thrilling. And my contribution there is to try to think about trans of color poetics. I felt like as an artist, critique felt too limiting, and was really inspired by Edward Glissant's idea of poetics as something that's not just linguistic, but that's about relations between people, that's about relations between people and geography. Glissant starts his description of poetics with the cry of the enslaved person thrown from a ship into the ocean, thinking about the poetics of that moment. So far beyond any simple linguistic idea. So I tried to do that in my work, to think about poetics as a repertoire a repertoire of gestures. And in particular, I tried to articulate 3 gestures: the cut, the shift, and the stitch, building on the work that I had been doing with wearable electronics, thinking about practice-based research and how to theorize the actual practices that I was doing every day to make artwork. Yeah, and thinking about how we could focus on action instead of categories. I feel like this endless obsession with how many categories we have and how many boxes we can tick is really encouraged by social media and capitalism, and is very neoliberal. And I really agree with Herman Gray's critique that, yeah, diversity is great for neoliberalism, because the more categories we have, the more niches they have to sell us things. So instead, I try to argue, learning from Gloria Anzaldúa and women of color feminism, argue for solidarity across identities, and to think about trans of color poetics as a global formation, and to say that what I'm looking for is not empathy, which is just some feeling, but solidarity, which to me requires action. And I feel that especially acutely right now, as we've seen 35 different states in this country pass anti-trans laws just this year. And so many news stories just last week about Roe versus Wade ending and what's next. And it's clear to me that trans healthcare is in danger. So the need for solidarity is very something I feel really strongly today. Okay, I want to read a bit of the conclusion. Yes, I'm jumping to the end. Hopefully you had a chance to read some of the beginning, sorry. But I feel like the conclusion is most relevant for our topic. I think I have about 9 minutes left. I'll try to not read the whole 9 minutes. The conclusion is called Visionary Trans of Color Futures. It starts with these 2 epigraphs. One is from Sylvia Rivera. She said, "A lot of heads were bashed at Stonewall, but it didn't hurt their true feelings. They all came back for more and more. Nothing. That's when you could tell that nothing could stop us at that time or any time in the future." I want to note that that is from an online zine called Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, that in order to quote other trans women in this book, I often had to rely on self-published texts. The next epigraph is from Raven Wings, and I'll explain more about it, but I'll start with this quote. She says, "You're lucky this is all that we did. You're lucky that we are appealing to your humanity. You're lucky that we're not asking for vengeance or revenge, because that's easy. Our love is radical, it's abolitionist. It's a future where each and every body has what they need, what they deserve, what they want." That was at a press conference in Toronto after dousing this colonizer sculpture in pink paint. So this first part's about Seattle. On June 13th, 2016, I attended another vigil for our community, a mourning ritual for trans and queer people of color at the Black Power Epicenter in Seattle. The event was held to honor and mourn the 49 trans and queer people murdered at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. Most of the victims were Puerto Rican. The song, sage, and togetherness of this healing space felt nourishing and necessary. Enacting the algorithm of mourning again, we fill in the variables of names and pictures every time for the circumstances of each new death. But the scale of this horrific event was much larger, requiring a different way of gathering and holding each other. So I want to say there, I'm not talking about an algorithm as something disdainful. I try to argue in the book that algorithms are much like rituals, and that we can decolonize them and reclaim them. Many people in Latinx, queer, and trans communities still ache from the Orlando massacre. The act of violent backlash against trans and queer Latinx people underscores the fact that we've begun to open queer and trans Latinx futures as a possible reality. And those futures make some people very afraid. Queer Latinx futures point to queerness as horizon, as described by Jose Munoz, and as possibility. Trans Latinx futures gesture towards worlds free of colonial borders of gender, sexuality, and nationality. As the Audre Lorde Project statement discussed in Chapter 5 states, these murders continue deeply troubling recent trends of escalating violence against Latinx people and trans and queer people of color more broadly. but any recent increase should be understood as part of an older colonial history of violence. Trans of color poetics respond to these histories, revealing and challenging the ways that colonial violence continues in white supremacist transphobic violence by offering visionary methods of creating safety through solidarity. Sylvia Rivera, of Puerto Rican and Venezuelan descent, was a crucial figure in advancing a movement for livable transgender lives. Rivera's futurist vision sharply contrasts the way that trans women of color have been often figured as the image of death, and imagines them instead as the image of futurity. While many examples exist of transgender characters in science fiction literature, trans women of color have been largely absent from science fiction films. Small footnote is that Star Trek Discovery is amazing and it has lots of trans people and trans people of color on it. So that was after this book was written. Queer theory has mobilized the figure of the Latina trans woman to represent regressive heteronormativity and false consciousness, as I discussed in chapter 3. Scholars of queer Latinidad tell a different story. In Sexual Futures, Queer Gestures, and Other Latina Longings, Juana Maria Rodriguez studies queer Latina gesture from contemporary art to daily life. She states, futurity has never been given to queers of color, children of color, and other marginalized communities that live under the violence of state and social erasure. Rodriguez sees potential in the expressive capacities of Latinx, queer and trans people to build new futures. In digital gaming communities, conversations about violence against trans women have been advanced by queer and trans game designers. On March 10th, 2015, Merritt K published an article about Gamergate, describing how the response from feminist game designers and scholars has focused only on the most privileged women. Kay writes, Black and Latina trans women, mostly sex workers, have been murdered every week in 2015. Collectively, we've failed these women, and we've built communities and organizations that mostly benefit people more powerful than them. And I'm worried about the same dynamic happening as we continue to resist online and offline harassment of marginalized people in games. End quote. She describes the siege mentality that defined many conversations about Gamergate, which reduced the issue of gender issue to gender and focused on the safety of white cisgender women, ignoring the trans people and people of color who were also targeted by the campaign of online violence that spread offline, seeping out into politics in the United States. Gamergate is one example of discussions of technology and social justice that fail to include the considerations of trans people of color, but there are many more. Trans of color poetics, as I've described it here, begins with the history of rituals of survival that gender nonconforming people have used throughout history, and to bring a more nuanced consideration of racialized gendered violence in digital media. The need for trans people of color to engage in creating their own futures by engaging with digital technologies is urgent, yet it has always been up to us to imagine our future through trans of color poetics. Okay, I want to skip a bit and talk about Raven Wings, and then I will wrap up. So I talk about in July 2020, just as this book was going into production, the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter uprising and the unprecedented uprising for Black trans lives that we saw then. But still note how little people discuss Nina Pop's death in comparison around the same time. On August 9th of that year, 2020, Black Lives Matter Toronto posted a video on Instagram of Raven Wings. It had 14,133 views at the time of this writing and had been reposted on many large social media accounts in a viral moment. The video showed Wings speaking at a press conference about the defacement of statues of the slaveholders and colonizers, Sir John A. Macdonald at Queen's Park and Egerton Ryerson at Ryerson University. Wings states, "We tried many different ways to get the attention and the conversation of those in leadership roles and positions. It took us having to do this to get y'all to show up. We've been writing letters. We've been creating books, photography, performance art. We've been doing every single way possible to let you know what we deserve, what we need. It's in the technology of Blackness that we find abolition, and in the technology of Black women, right, that we find radical love and intersectionality. The technology of Black trans folks in leadership roles. Our love is radical, it's abolitionist. It's a future where each and everybody has what they need, what they deserve, what they want. It's raising your kid who's 4 years old and who is not afraid of the police. Wing's words, reproduced algorithmically through social media thousands of times, describe the technology of Black trans folks working toward a vision of futures shaped by abolitionist love. In this book, I avoided asking what non-trans people can do to stop the murders of trans people of color, and instead focused on the brilliant technologies that Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color have created to survive centuries of genocidal efforts to end our lives. Oh, I'm running out of time. Just a few sentences from the end and then I'm done. In this time when COVID-19 is disproportionately killing Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people and poor people, necropolitics is made plainly visible. In the failure to prosecute the police who killed Breonna Taylor, the state's role to decide who must be killed is made evident. There's still so much work to be done, with Minneapolis faltering on its promise to end policing and Black Lives Matter murals being used as cosmetic appeasements without real structural changes to policing. In these new movements, continuing the work of Black Lives Matter, we see trans people of color and their allies responding to the violence of racist transphobia, the legacy of slavery and ongoing colonialism with poetic gestures, splashes of bright pink paint, fuchsia stencils that say abolish, pink and Black feathered costumes, new forms of network solidarity, and new demands for cuts to police budgets as a step toward the abolition of police and prisons. In these gestures, one can see shifting, stitching, and cutting, combining in a ritual of resistance that is an old algorithm that will continue looping far into the future in new iterations and permutations. As Sylvia Rivera said, they may try, but nothing can stop us now or anytime in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Misha and Percy. Hex, I wonder if we could pass the mic to you.
Sure, yeah. So, yeah, as far as things go now, are we just doing like conversations and questions and things? Awesome. Yeah. Do we have any questions on the list yet? I also want to thank everyone for your amazing presentations. Thank you so much.
We do have some questions, but I was wondering if Percy and Misha maybe had questions for each other or responses. And maybe that would give us a chance to look at the questions that are on the Google Doc.
Misha, can you share celebrations of joy with your recent publication? Can you take this opportunity to?
Yeah, thank you. I was also going to ask if you could say more, any more about your own work and poetry and poetics. But you want me to go first? I can say, yeah, it's weird. It's weird being an academic. It's weird working on a thing for 9 years and then it finally being out in the world. So yeah, it has been a real, a lot of celebrations. We had an in-person book launch here at UC Santa Cruz, and Nick Mitchell and Joe Cassell both gave really generous and kind responses. But yeah, it took a lot of struggle, many years of work to get this out. But I'm really happy that it's in the world, and yeah, I hope people read it. do you want to share any more with us about your poetry and poetics and writing?
Again, a lot of it was in response and reaction and to ongoing neocolonialism. And I think it's through the speaker series, and that's text, right? That is text. And that is creative, and that's critical, and that's foundational. And hopefully people are able to do personal communication in their own, wherever they are. And I don't want to prioritize the academics, right? I'm not a very good academic in the sense that my introduction, I didn't introduce all my roles. Frankly, I don't care, right? Because I'm making the institution look good. I want to highlight the relationships that I've made and continue to make in community and the land. That's my joy, and those are the things I want to celebrate. Because as someone, as Blue Waters, Two-Spirit Elder, has said, their PhD is of the land, right? All these institutions exist because of stolen land and occupation. And yet they deprioritize it and don't want to celebrate knowledge production and dissemination of our knowledge keepers, such as Blue Waters. And they further say that the institution needs us more than we need it. We're always producing knowledge. We're always in relationship to others. We're always thinking about the ways in which we can have sustainable moments while continuously reacting to ongoing colonialism of disappear the native. There's no such thing as two-spirit people. If you're gonna be a queer person, you gotta leave your indigeneity at the door before you come in and do what queer people do, right? It's always, the baseline is whiteness and white people, right? I think in terms of joy, is the service part of being an academic. I decided to become a board member of CPATH, which is Canadian Associations for Trans Professionals. What does that mean? I'm not a medical doctor, right? And for what I know, the origin story of CPATH is that it was, again, in opposition to WPATH. Now, people can get all up in arms here about that critique or that bit of the conversation. But even as I sat on the board, I was the only Indigenous person. And the former president, Dr. Michael Marshall, was the only Black person. And everybody else was white, right? And how is that meant to raise up and support trans affirming care and support if you only have one Black person, one First Nations person, and you don't even think about the experiences of folks from the North or Inuit relatives or Métis relatives and kin, right? Or young folks. I mean, I'm coming into language, and I really appreciate the young folks who are pushing back and wanting to expand their acronym and saying that this served its purpose at the time, but this is who I am and this is how I am in the world, and you need to add the I. You need to add this letter to the acronym, and who cares if it's 36 letters that we have to see out? That means it actually captures the diversity of who we are as 2S LGBTQIA plus folks, right? So the joy that I've had is that I was able to, with this very small board, what then became an operational board, really center the experiences of Black and Indigenous racialized disabled folks around care, and wanting to really support CPATH to be reimagined as something else that doesn't center medical white cis professionals when it comes to trans affirming care and support. Did we get a lot of pushback? Yes, we got a lot of white flight. People having critical conversations about what it means to be Black, Indigenous, and racialized and gender diverse, and the ways people are complicit in that. People resigned, right? So that's what happens when you have critical conversations about really centering the experiences of Black and Indigenous and racialized gender diverse folks nationally in the context of the Canadian nation state. So was able to gather, based on my relationships nationally and the relationships of the project team, 21 person advisory committee to give direction on identity, on safety, on governance, name change, because 3/4 of the advisory said, well, I'm not Canadian, I'm First Nations, or I'm Cree, or I'm this. So right there, Canadian in the name of CPAP already is a deterrent. And what can it do for me other than abstract information and make itself look good? And that is really a theme for the ways in which Indigenous thought and knowledges and worldviews continue to get sucked up in the academic industrial complex. That you have one conversation with an Indigenous person and you get a career built off of it. Yet those communities and those people still continue to suffer under the colonialism and whiteness and white supremacy, right? Hence it needs us more than we need it. Right, being the academic industrial complex. So yes, I'm complicit, I'm here. I'm in one of the 3 top harmful areas for Indigenous people. I'm a social worker. The origin story already started to exclude, as a profession, social work, Black and Indigenous people, but yet both in the Canadian and American context, they're the overpopulated people in the social work industrial complex. I'm a researcher. Indigenous people, regardless of identity, will say, you've researched us to death, right? And I'm an academic, right? So what does it mean for me to be here, sitting in the position to say that, okay, I'm complicit of ongoing harms against Indigenous communities and intersecting identities? Well, as I'm here, the system's not going to change. It doesn't want to. It wants to throw EDI words around, right? But it's another way to step away from human rights, right? It also wants to, it wants to just do the terrible thing that came from the 60s, 70s, 80s of checking off a box to say, yes, we have our Indian. Yes, we have our trans person. Yes, we have our two-spirit person. We've done our work, right? Until, like the notion of abolition, I'm always concerned when it comes to speaking about abolition, whether people will Zoom bomb or really find a way to get at me and the other speakers. But abolition is the future I reimagine, because prior to contact, we had our own ways of helping. We were already doing knowledge production and dissemination and engaging with other communities of people in radical relationality, ethically, right? Ethical relationality. So yeah, so that's some of the things that I enjoy working. I mean, the document that we're doing, I'm going to be the editor for a book. Like, we're taking that 100-page document, we're turning it into chapters. Again, I'll be going to South Pacific and get direction from them. How do they want my help? Do they just want me to be around? What do they want, right? Because I was able to take the conversations of so many people over decades around gender-based violence and talk about ways in which as settlers, cis folks, heterosexual folks can take direction from 2S LGBTQI folks. And in the Canadian context, if people think, well, oh, we can't do that. Well, you've had the red paper policy, which is in response to the white paper policy in 1969. You have the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, For Us, By Us. You have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 94 calls to action. You now have the National Enquirer, 232 calls to justice, and our 32 calls to justice, and how to help minimize the experiences of gender-based violence for 2S LGBTQIA folks. So there are a lot of things that Indigenous people generously and patiently continue to say, here's a For Us, By Us, and this is what you can do to stop harming us, to stop hurting us, to stop disappearing us, right? So yeah.
Yeah, with you on all of that. Thank you so much for that. Do folks feel like they're ready for a question from the audience at all? How do people feel about that? Good. Okay, cool. Because there was one in there that I was also super curious about. Someone wanted to know both Nisha and Percy, about your research methods. And as a nerd, I'm also super interested in everyone's research methods. So, yeah.
Yeah, I could start. I Hi Masa, thanks for coming. Yeah, I do practice-based research. So that means to me that research doesn't have to be just reading and writing or interviews. That I learned plenty through making performances, through making electronic garments, through doing workshops, through making artwork. And so it looks different all the time because I have ADHD and my attention span runs out for things. So I seem to change mediums almost every project. Yeah, I did a live performance for a while, and then I really focused on doing this online game, Redshift and Portal Metal, so that the performances were well filmed and recorded, so more people could have access to them online. And then lately I've been working on, I finally have started to articulate that I work on multidisciplinary art projects. So I was really trained as a conceptual artist and understand artwork as really, my artwork practice as really guided by questions. And that the form and the medium comes after, to think about what is the best form that might help me move forward on this question. And so with the last big art project I did that was a practice-based research project was called Scene Soul. I started it in Seattle. It's poetry and movement and installation and augmented reality about climate change and the way climate change is disproportionately harming trans people and immigrants and disabled people in particular. It's different stories, different poems in that game. And then I released it in 2020. Thank you so much, Chigan. I could show an image even if people want to see that. Let's see, I have some slides of it. It looks like this. Yeah, you can get it in the Apple App Store for iOS devices. So this is just what it looks like in the park next to where I used to live. But it will look like your house if you're using it in your house. But it's designed to be like you have to walk an outdoor space with it. So to get through different parts of the story. In this case, you can see I had to move to like different parts of this big open park. So if you're looking at it in your house or apartment, you're only going to get like the first poem. You have to keep going. And yeah, it includes these movement and dance pieces, and the poems are on screen and you hear the poems. And I think we have time, right? I could show a short clip of it even. Yeah, cool. Okay, here's what that one looks like. I don't think I shared sound. Do you hear the sound? Hello. Hello? Albuterol is a rush. Ventolin, albuterol sulfate, my inhaler. I only leave the house today to walk, Roja. I try to find the words. Do you have a respirator? An air mask, a breathing mask. The woman looks confused. Then she laughs. She says, we're out. The whole county is out. Danced the connections between my rotating spine and hips, and all the love I have for my Latinx girl body, flickering in the hollow projector, twirling on the tips of my toes across their webs of connection, pirouetting past the bots. Okay. That's a clip of it. So you can see there's dance and poetry and music. I wrote most of the music there, and then we did installations with it. So we did a scan of the forest near Seattle, Catches Lake, the forest at Catches Lake, and projected those scans of the forest so that viewers could see the forest background in the app. And my dog is in it, Roja. A bunch of the poems are about walking her because that was the only time I left the house. And it's kind of wild to me now that I wrote these poems in 2017 and 2018 about being stuck inside, having to wear a mask, only leaving the house when I was walking my dog. It was like a pandemic precursor to have that smoke storm. And then I used it in live dance performances. And then now my research looks like thinking about the ocean and climate change and how I can be writing through loss and grief, and how do we think about moving forward and dancing, even though we're dealing with the loss of people to COVID and places to climate change. Yeah, how do we build from this place?
Those are beautiful pieces. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. If Percy, if you feel like it, I'd love to also hear about your research methods.
Yeah, I think before I even do that, I just want to push back. Research methods comes from what? What is the origin story, right? So the origin story academically centers your Western thought, right? They talk about how it's objective, but you're starting from someone's research questions. So isn't that subjective? Let's be real and let's be honest about that, right? So I'm going to push back on that. I think through my academic journey, I didn't have mentors. People saw my confidence as, saw me as unmentorable. I saw many of my colleagues who started their PhD, same as me or after me, get mentored to be a mainstream, to be a thriving academic in the year Western terms. So that first, I had to figure out, well, what is it about me that was unmentorable? What was it about? Because I had, like, prior to my first tenure track appointment, previously held at University of Manitoba, I had 14 research projects. I had no infrastructural support, right? I have this document that I wrote, but in 2006, I got a $50,000 grant, and I did participatory talking circles around gender-based violence. So that's the first time my experience. I asked 40 people and I learned what not to do. I asked them 56 questions in a survey. I didn't consider accessibility. That's a no-no. Nobody was there to say, Percy, knock it off. Right. And then I asked 7 questions in talking circle. You don't do that. Right. There's a lot I've learned from that time to now of what not to do. But I had nobody to mentor me. No Indigenous scholars, because they saw my being forward as aggressive. Right. And I'm sure trans and Two-Spirit folks can know this experience. If you're confident, you're seen as aggressive and angry. If you question, you're being violent, right? That's the way in which we're coded already. So my experience has been, okay, I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but there are things being done by non-Indigenous people. That's just messy. It's harmful. It's hurtful. It's damaging. So I just, again, everything I've done has been in response to colonialism, to don't do this. Right. And then community saw me as in the role of researcher and said, okay, you're our community member, but research in the past has caused harm. What makes you different? Which is a vital question that we need to answer for. Right. And then I had the benefit of being in circle with Dr. Cynthia Dillard, who in 2014 was able to share, when you engage in communities and research, are you doing it to help or to bleed? And that just blew my mind. What is the purpose? Why am I reacting? And when can this be about joy and celebration and outside the lens of trauma porn? So a lot of the stuff I do, again, is from a place of reaction. It has been community led. I was part of Taking Action Project, which is a huge part of what gave birth, not legitimized, but just really gave birth to Native Youth Sexual Health Network, which is a global force of knowledge production by young, by us, young Indigenous, 2S LGBTQI folks. A lot of work there that I learned about, okay, it's not just about reading and writing, because that wasn't my strength, because what the reading and writing was out there. Again, no foundational text represented me or my lens. And that's something Misha already acknowledged earlier in how they presented and their responses. And I'm like, okay, if there's nothing about me here, then how can people see me beyond the statistics of 78% engage in suicide, 78, or the other statistics of the ways in which we're constantly coping with ongoing colonialism, right? So my methods are community-based. My methods are, I follow the OCAP principles of ownership, control, access, and possession. It's always community driven. Projects are, if people say knock it off, I knock it off. I looked at who's doing research and why are they getting crap loads of money and I'm getting $50,000. So now I'm a national reviewer, one of the largest bodies in Canada for funding, CIHR, and SHIRK. I get to see anything related to health, to spirit, trans, Indigenous. And I say yes or no now, because I need to support Indigenous folks getting money for us, by us, right? Because there's still this phenomenon of non-Indigenous people building their careers off of data mining extraction by taking from our communities, going to conferences, getting these big book deals. And yet those communities are still in the positions and situations that they were when that scholar came in and said, let's talk about your pain. Let's talk about intergenerational trauma. Let's talk about what it means to be in the sex trade or trafficked. Let's talk about all these other topics, right? So community-led OCAP principles, and it's multidisciplinary. Because it may have taken one way to get here, colonialism, but there's going to be multiple ways of knowing and being and methods that need to get out from this hot mess that we currently find ourselves in. And myself as well, because I can't say that I'm not complicit, because I am. Again, I'm in the top 3 things that continue to cause harm to Indigenous people. I think foundational, outside of relationality and building relationships that are reciprocal and mutually beneficial, it's harm reduction. And I know people might think, oh, what do you mean, naloxone kit? No, that's part of it. That's the part that gets stigma attached to the notion of the practice of harm reduction. But harm reduction really is meeting people where they're at, taking direction from people, recognizing that I, as a vessel, have the capacity to cause 10,000 harms. But with critical reflexivity, I have the capacity to recognize those things and bring them down to 200. And another thing that I do is that it's unethical for me to say that this will be a safe conversation in a space, right? What I can do is because I can't make it a safe space. Doesn't matter what my business card says or the sign on my door says or what institution I'm part of. Those things are harmful, right? They continue to harm the many communities that I have membership in as identity. What I can do is I can say, I can make this a brave space. I can make it a brave space that you can show up as how you want to and can at the time. And you get to dictate how this time, and I'll hold space for that. And if there's a comeuppance where I need to be held accountable, then I'm in a space to say, yes, I was responsible for X, Y, Z in this interaction. And these are the things, because another thing that gets thrown around here in the Canadian context is reconciliation. Well, reconciliation identifies that you've been standing on my feet, right? And standing on my feet has been hurting me. Reconciliation is the action of, what are you going to do to make sure you don't stand on my feet again. So those are practices that I put out and that I actually actualize. If I'm standing on your feet, I don't know. But these are the ways that I'm going to make sure I never stand on your feet again, whether it's an individual, somebody I'm mentoring, somebody whose own educational journey I'm supporting, or a community, right? So yeah. So those are some of my approaches and some of the methodologies. And it's a story, right? Of why I choose the approaches I do and why I want to push back on the current ones that are there. And to truly center community and Indigenous knowledges.
Yeah. Research and research methodologies and talking about social work and Indigenous communities is so complex. And thank you for speaking to all of that. Yeah, I really, really appreciate it. There was a request for a little bit of a clarification from the audience, because I feel like many of the audience are not super familiar with Indigenous cultures, and asking if you could talk a little bit more about what talking circles are and how they relate to research and stuff and Indigenous culture in general.
So yeah, thank you for that. Talking circles, they call them focus groups. Talking circles are, I know research indicates that you can't be friends, you can't give gifts, but that's a huge foundational practice in Indigenous communities outside of who are you and where are you from, right? That's what often happens. I mean, I'm on vacation here and I was in a restaurant eating with my family, and this table next to us, hey, where are you from? We thought you were native. And then we just had the intertribal connections with each other. So talking circles are something that Indigenous research folks or facilitators of research information wanted to have circles. And the ways in which I've done it, and it's not going to be the same with all Indigenous people, but they might have their own approach. I don't speak for all talking circles, right? I just want to make those disclaimers. But that when I was able to be part of talking circles, I made sure that there was an elder there that represented everybody's identities. Cis man, cis woman, trans, right? Femme, trans, mask, for spiritual support for the space, that people could go and have a conversation based on the 2 or 3 questions that I was going to be in conversation, not the 7, right? That people were fed, that if people were responsible for someone, whether an adult, a partner, a child, or a parent, that they had support to be in the space. And that people had transportations to get to and from the space we were at, that people chose. So then it would start with an opening, one of the knowledge keepers would open the purpose, state the purpose, my purpose and my role, that at any time people can say, stop, time out, do whatever they need to do. The medicines would be available. And medicines, I don't just mean pills. The medicines I'm speaking to in terms of an Indigenous context might be sage, cedar, tobacco, sweetgrass, eagle feather, staff, or the protocol of that land and of the people. And then we would have an item. People would choose an item. Maybe it might be my juice bottle, that I might pass it off to Hex, and that they might respond to the question or a question, or how they're doing, a check-in to open the circle outside the knowledge keepers, and that everybody has an opportunity to take this item and speak and then pass it on, and everybody has the autonomy to say I pass, or I think this is shit, or I think this is great. Why is this the first time I'm experiencing this? And then we take a break, we get sustained, we close, and that people still have access to these knowledge keepers, because we can ask you how the sky is blue all this time, And it's not until I'm on my way home that I have reactions, visceral reactions, or triggers, or flashbacks from being in conversation with the topic of why is the sky blue? And that I can then be responsible for the care of those folks, and that they can still contact those knowledge keepers. So that's what being part of a talking circle has been for me, based on the direction of the people that I've worked with, and communities that I've worked with, that they've needed to be in conversation about the topic, why is the sky blue? So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or if it's just more confusing. It's steeped in protocol, directed by protocol, and constantly changing, a willingness to deviate, which not often happens in circles and of non-Indigenous researchers.
Thank you so much for that, Percy. Here's a question for both you and Misha. People are wondering how those of us in attendance can support your work. As in get you and your orgs paid and recognized. That's an exciting question. I love that one.
Don't give to the university. If you want to give back to Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction Network, Indigenous Harm Reduction in Vancouver, Native Youth Sexual Health Network. Those are the organizations that I believe in. Give to one of the many Two-Spirit agencies in the Canadian context, traveling numbers in Vancouver, Edmonton Two-Spirit Society in Edmonton, Two-Spirit local, Chief local in Manitoba, Two-Spirit people of Manitoba, Two-Spirit people of the First Nations, Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance. You can give to those folks. Those folks sustain me, and they hold me accountable, and they're actually doing sustainable work. If you're looking for, if you're in the health sector here, folks, if you're looking for policy on how to support 2S LGBTQI folks during COVID, because if anything, COVID has reminded us who the haves and have-nots are, and many of us here for intersecting identities are the have-nots, right? They have some, Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance has a report that talks about the experiences of 2S LGBTQI folks. So yeah, so that's some of the ways. You don't need to pay university, but then again, I'm not actively an artist, so I don't have a webpage. It's just the people. I think Misha will have a lot more, an extensive list of people in the community as well to how to support them.
You mean how to support her? Or maybe you mean the organizations? Yes. Yes, I agree. Don't give money to the university. I mean, you know, all the organizations that I talk about in the book, it would be great to support them. So Gender Justice LA in Los Angeles, Maggie Sex Worker Action Network in Toronto, Ilnana Diversity Dance Company in Toronto is Raven Wings dance company. And at the end of Redshift, it tells you to donate to Grassy Narrows. I think it's freegrassy.net. But I mean, I feel like most of the people, at least that I invited, are students. So I don't want you to be paying anybody, but I want you to be reading the book. I think the most important way for people to support my work is to actually read it. I think a lot of times I have experienced a lot of, you know, tokenization. You know, people want to invite a trans person and promote it and have posters and then not show up or not listen or not read their writing because it's just about performative allyship, right? So that's the most important thing to me, is that people read it and talk about it to other people and, you know, learn about the work of other Two-Spirit and trans of color artists and travesti artists. Yeah. And hopefully you can or have your library order it so you can get it for free. Other questions? I hope all my students here today have been asking questions.
There are definitely more questions.
Okay.
I'm trying to pick one that that's fun. Let's see. Here's a question for you, Nisha. What advice would you give to junior scholars who want to teach your work, particularly in academic and classroom spaces, even if that advice is not?
Thanks. There's a lot of background noise, Hex. What advice would you give to junior scholars who want to teach your work, particularly in academic or cultural spaces, even if the advice is don't? No, that's not the advice. Yeah, please teach it. What advice do I have to teach my work for junior scholars? Interesting. I think that I hope that the online companion for the book is a really useful addition to help teach it. It's linked in the introduction. There's an online website that shows all the artwork from the book. I think it's scalar.usc.edu/works/poetic-operations, but maybe Chingy's going to put it in the chat. I don't know. If not, I'll put it in the chat later. My hope is that the artwork can be, engaging and visceral, and, seeing Raven Wings dance, seeing all my collaborators in Sao Paulo moving and dancing, in my experience, is a good way to engage audiences. Thank you so much, Chingy. Yeah. So hopefully the artworks themselves can be conversation starters. I mean, I read from the introduction today because I feel like that's the most timely part. So, if you're, maybe that part might be better for freshmen if I don't know. I feel like the introduction is more about proposing algorithmic analysis as a method, which is maybe oriented more towards grad students. And thinking about, how we could think about actions and gestures instead of categories, and thinking about how algorithms are like rituals, and people should understand that, can understand that, hopefully can relate to a ritual or a recipe more than they can relate to code. A lot of people. So I often say that my first computer programming class I took in undergrad, the first assignment the professor gave us was to write the instructions to tie your shoes. And me being the pain in the butt that I was like, fuck this guy, what a waste of my time. I know how to program. I don't need this. What a dumb exercise. I wish I could remember that person's name so I could thank him, because I ended up writing a book about algorithms in daily life and algorithms for safety, But when we think about, the book is about digital media, but I'm trying to encourage people to think about algorithms as not just digital. Algorithms were invented in the 8th century in what is today Uzbekistan by Muhammad ibn al-Khwarizmi. So there were no computers. We can think about algorithms as just like a recipe, a series of steps, a series of instructions. And my hope is that the poems and performances in the book make that clear, because I think that it's important for us, for people of color, trans people, indigenous people, two-spirit people, to understand the systems that are being used against us every day, and algorithms are being violently used against us every single day. And yeah, so that is like a kind of central idea in the book that I guess might be helpful for teaching. And I don't know, I have not taught in carceral spaces, but I don't know if the part about prison abolition is a part to discuss and focus on, or if it is a part to avoid. Maybe somebody else in the room who has done that could speak up. But yeah, definitely like the chapter on the cut, the chapter on the performance from Sao Paulo is thinking about how do we build safety networks that don't rely on any digital technology? How do we actually just have conversations amongst each other, like, will you walk home with me? Will you walk to class with me? If you get assaulted, who do you want me to call? If I get assaulted, I don't want you to call the police. I want you to call this list of other people. Or even, would you go to the doctor with me? Conversations like that are what I think is the best outcome of that performance in chapter 1, the cut. And, you know, the kind of conversations that I hope people keep having about how do we learn actual safety practices to keep each other safe, because governments are not going to do it. Governments are the one causing all the colonial violence and carceral violence on a daily basis. Oh, thanks, Penelope. The library already has it, and Penelope put a link in the chat. Or Jingy, yes, thanks.
Heck yeah. Thank you so much for that, Misha. I also want to apologize about my background noise. I was supposed to be in an office, but a bunch of stuff happened, and I am actually in a hallway, and sometimes people walk by, and they're loud. So, yeah. Yeah. So anyway, who wants another question? Because I love some of these questions. Here's a question for both Percy and Misha. What advice do you have for those just starting on the path as a community worker or artist or scholar? And how did you get started yourselves?
One thing that was asked of me as I was nearing the western door of my PhD, it took me quite a while to defend, because like not having a mentor, I constantly had people leave my committee without telling me. So it was a very traumatic and violent experience, my PhD. I was able to defend this last November, and it was accepted as is. And that's a phenomenon that doesn't happen at the University of Toronto. I had no additions, edits, or anything. It was just uploaded. But I did that. It wasn't the help of the people in my committee. I actually had to find members of my committee to be my committee. I had to do all the work. So I feel like I should have it was a collaborative doctorate in philosophy, the social justice education, and women and gender studies. How did I start out? I started the first condom exchange in my reserve, because at the time GRID was happening, and I'm dating myself for folks. GRID is what then became Gay Cancer, which then became the HIV movement in the early 80s. I was functionally illiterate, and my older cousin, who gave me my name Percy from my previously Indian Act name, government name, told me I was gay and told me my name Percy, which was fine. And then I had asked them, well, what does gay mean? And so they censored, and they looked at the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which is a source of knowledge on reserve, if it wasn't from the land or elders or ceremony, and they bypassed 1 and 2, and they said meant to be happy. And I'm like, okay, well, how am I happy? And am I still causing people to die from gay cancer, right? How are they dying from cancer? as a young person. So there's a literal river, like many reserves and reservations in the States, have been displaced Indigenous people out of very common waterways, because we didn't have Route 66. We had waterways and trails, right? And they displaced us and moved us out of sight, out of mind. Disappears as a thing of the past, right? Always in the past, right? And so I was like, okay, fudge. So where do we go to stop hurting people? So I crossed the river that separated my reservation from the white settler town. Went to the health center as a young person. I don't know if other people can relate. I grew up in poverty. I've been working since I was 6 on the land, in the orchards, logging, driving vehicles, raising children. That was my experience, and it can be experienced by many Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks. Went to the town, and as a result, the clothes that I had were handed down 4 times with patches on patches on patches. Bathing was not something that we could do. We had to go to the creek because we didn't have running water. So I went to the health center, looked unbathed, patches on patches on patches, went to the counter where the nurse practitioner was, banged on it and said, how can I stop hurting people? Well, when you have an Indigenous child who looked like I did, saying the things and actions that I did, it gets a risk assessment, right? When they found out that I actually wasn't there to hurt anyone, but I actually wanted to know about this gay cancer, which we now know as HIV/AIDS, they were able to inform me with decision to know the information that it's men who have sex with men, or injection drug users, and then forth. And because I knew many of the people due to colonialism, knew that people were hiding aspects of themselves. They would be in these heterosexual cis relationships, but yet when they partied, when they were out and about, were with other folks. And that was a way for transmission to happen. So took condoms, took lube, learned how to do the recovery positions, went to parties on reserve to protect people and give condoms to folks. So that's how I started. And I shared the stage with Christos and Beth Brandt, opened for one of their books with Daphne Marlin and Betsy Warlands in Vancouver, and had them giggling behind me. I was 17 years old when that book came out, and I had shared the stage with them and had them oohing and eyeing, because I was just, at that time, I didn't have the words, but they called me a butch dyke. I didn't know what that word meant. I came from the reserve, and had them giggling and hooing and hawing over me as I engaged people who attended that book launch, and then became friends and family to both the late Beth Brandt and Christos, and met a lot of other Indigenous 2S LGBTQIA creatives. So I was just in the right place at the right time, met people, was asked to talk. And since I'm very engaging and can be given 2 minutes to talk on a topic before I have to talk, was able to spew poetry, spoken word, and that's how I started. I'm sure there are a lot more formal ways that can happen. And I'm sure you'll get a very detailed way that's a lot more informative from Misha than me, other than being in the right place at the right time, wanting to respond to why are these conditions the way they are, and how can I help minimize them, because it's going to affect my family. And it did in terms of HIV. Many of my relatives seroconverted and have since passed. I've gone the academic route, my left brain, right brain. Would I love to write a book of poetry? Absolutely. Because I have some of the works that was shared with me, and I was like, oh crap, I forgot about those things when I wrote in response spoken word. So yeah, so that's how I got started, and then I'm sure Misha's going to give you a lot more informative of ways to formally be an artist.
I don't know about that, but I have some thoughts. I have some thoughts. I just lost them all. I mean, I guess the first thing that I would say about doing an artist is like being an artist is that you can do it. It's I think that we're told like all these like myths about artists and creativity, and that there's like only a few creative geniuses that are just gifted by the universe at being creative. And it's like, who are those people? Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Picasso. What do they all have in common? White men. It just so happens that these white men just are gifted with brilliance and creativity, and they just come up with inventions, and wow, amazing. That's clearly, we can all acknowledge that that's BS, right? And that in fact, creativity is a skill. It's a thing you practice and learn. I don't think I'm a very creative person. I mean, I write poetry, it's mostly like observation. I dance, it's mostly about just feeling my body and being in relationship with the space. So it's a job also, you know? You work on your artwork, trying to create something awesome. Then you got to do all the work of promoting it. Then maybe somebody sees it and asks you to put it in an exhibition. Do all the work of putting it in the exhibition. Then you can do all the work of promoting and try to get people to see the exhibition. And after all that, hopefully some people saw it and then try to do it again, make another work. You know, you just persist at that job. It's a job. That's how I feel about it. Yeah. And also, I don't know, I wanted to be an artist when I was young. I also was really living in poverty after my parents divorced. My mom was mentally ill. We didn't have a lot for many years. And I don't know, I think that gave me a sense of like injustice of the world, of like, why don't we have electricity and those people have ATVs? I don't understand. And I wanted to be a filmmaker when I was a teenager, but my dad was an immigrant. He was like, we didn't come here from Colombia for you to be a broke ass filmmaker. And he really expected me to be a scientist. And I got a job doing tech stuff. And so I ended up doing computer science for my first degree. He paid for it. I'm incredibly grateful. But I got that degree in computer science. And then later, when I was older, after working in the industry and realizing how bored I was as sitting in front of a computer all day and had some say, I was doing a lot of activism and media activism. And then I met this artist, Ricardo Dominguez, and I was like, wow, somehow this guy's figured out how to do art and activism and technology and make it and get paid for it. I just want to do what this guy does. So I went to school, I applied to go to school with him, and I got in to UCSD, and I got to study with him for 3 years, and it worked. But lucky for me, he was incredibly generous, a generous collaborator. When we worked on the Transborder Immigrant Tool, which was this cell phone to help people find water in the US-Mexico border and get across borders, he just made sure that even though I was a student, like my name was next to his, next to all the other collaborators, like there were 5 of us. And, I worked on some other faculty projects that you would never know. I worked on their projects, or they paid me to work on those projects. I'm somewhere in the credits, maybe on their website. But yeah, Ricardo was a generous collaborator and committed to us being equals. And that was really life-changing. I guess the other thing that I think is important is to really find your people. My first quarter in grad school, the first class I took, the professor tried to have me kicked out of the program. She was like, this person is not an artist, doesn't know anything about art, is not going to be an artist, and is disrupting the class with their ignorance of art. And went to the department chair and went to my advisor and tried to have me kicked out. And lucky for me, Ricardo was my advisor, and he was like, no, I do activism as art too, and so does she, and we're gonna support her, and I ended up staying. And similarly, when I started my PhD, I took this idea about creating local safety networks for queer and trans people of color to my advisor, and white, masculine, queer advisor. And he said something to me, I think his words were, violence is what we worked on in the 90s, you should move on. you really want to talk about that for your dissertation? You really want to talk about that for the next 10 years of your life? Oh, ooh. And I almost just put that project in a box and was like, yeah, I guess he's right. I should just forget it. Forget local autonomy networks and move on. It was a bad idea. But lucky me, I applied to go to the Allied Media Conference. It's this conference of activists and artists and in Detroit. And I mean, when I applied there, they were like, yeah, we know you applied to do one spot on a panel, but we'd like you to do the keynote about this project because we want to highlight abolitionist technology. And yes, we need local safety networks. This is a great idea. So that was my first year of my PhD. It totally changed my path and ended up being a lot of what I wrote about in the dissertation and the book. And the last thing I want to say on that note is also about the AMC. I see Percy's comment also. Maybe you want to say that aloud. Yeah. I mean, I do want to acknowledge that I have a lot of light skin privilege that certainly made being in academia easier and makes being an artist easier in some ways. So that helps, unfortunately. But a thing about the Allied Media Conference, one last thing I wanted to say about all this was that the AMC has a list of principles. I think I copied the URL. Yeah, they have a list of principles that for their network that have been really just guiding for me the whole way through. And the first principle of theirs is we begin by listening. And I just think it's such a beautiful and important principle. Like whatever art project you want to do or activist project you want to do, probably somebody's been working on that for 10 years or 20 years or 100 years or 1,000. So, you know, maybe start by listening to what other people have done and then try to contribute constructively to the conversation. I'll stop there.
Percy, did you have some more stuff to say?
Well, yeah, it also helps that I come from a family of artist activists. We had an Elkin Center, which was the birthplace of folks like Richard Van Camp. It came to our school and a lot of other folks before they transferred over to University of Victoria or UBC, Joy Harjo and all those folks. So my late aunts, Lee Miracle, and my current late aunt, Jeanette Armstrong, creatives. Also helps that was just the norm to use creative means to, you know, share information, to connect with others and be emotive. So that also helped. Not everybody has that. I know that's a privilege to have access to those powerhouses in Indigenous literature. Yeah, and then I was able to just meet other creatives. I mean, heck, who for the first time doing opening for a book launch gets to read with Beth Banth and Christos? Those are the grandmothers of Two Spirit spoken word. I do, right? It just had to be in the right place at the right time because who my family's connected to. Yeah.
Awesome. So I think we've got time for like one more really short question. All of these questions are like so meaty though. Let's see. I feel like this one could be maybe a little shorter. It's just to ask both of you, what does interdisciplinary mean to you? It could be a long one or a short one. I don't know. Or it'll have to be short, I guess, because we only have like a couple more minutes. And I was requested to give like 5 at the end, so G can announce some stuff. So maybe like a mood board of what interdisciplinary means to you.
Do you want to start, Percy?
Sure. I think to be Indigenous is interdisciplinary, right? And like Indigenous people are constantly fighting for, we are scientists. Indigenous science. We're here long before settlers came and occupied and stole lands. We were helpers. We were doctors. We helped heal. We helped all these things. So I think interdisciplinary means the ways in which I had to get through my PhD, I had to do all the work. Despite the legend Harvard of the North, U of T, and all the pompous with that, actually made it much more difficult. So I actually had to be the one to get over the barriers and all the bumps in the road. And I had to learn how to advocate this system before I even started my first tenure track position. Interdisciplinary means not one way of knowing, but Indigenous knowledges are not just one way of knowing. There's multiple ways of knowing and being. So I think that is a starting point in conversation of what interdisciplinary means to me. I'm a social worker, chair of an Indigenous studies program. How interdisciplinary can that be? Right? It means being able to take a little bit from all these theoretical frameworks and make sense of it. And then in turn, take those into the classroom and support learners to take those little bits and make it accessible and digestible and palatable. And then go into meetings and being able to take those little bits of pieces here and there for service. And attending spaces like this to be in conversation with other thinkers with their own subject positionality and geographical locations that you're tied to, right? And the protocol of those places, having the capacity to be fluid, right? And be able to take a little bit and make sense of it and be in conversation about it. So that's what starting point for how it looks like and how I engage with that concept.
Thank you. And thanks for the question. I think about, the first thing that comes to mind is Audre Lorde's quote, like, we don't have single issue struggles because we don't live single issue lives. And one of my biggest inspirations is Gloria Anzaldúa. I know there's some critiques of her discussion of indigeneity, but I feel like her book, Borderlands, was a huge inspiration for me. I think it's like in one book, she's writing poetry, autobiography, history in English, Spanish, and Nahuatl, and just incredible example to me of genre bending, breaking, destroying, and I think still really challenging. I think a lot of spaces still really demand some kind of disciplinary rigor, like academic publishers want to know what category goes on the back of the book so they can sell it in that category, because if they can't, then they don't want to publish it. And a lot of art spaces are still really concerned with really rigid ideas of what's art or what's the genre being presented. So I think Anzaldúa's work is really inspiring to me. I think academically, it means to me some engagement with multiple disciplines. I think that early on as a student, I thought that being interdisciplinary meant like, I don't have to care about disciplines. Who cares? They don't exist. I'm past that. But now I actually feel like, no, I work between a few different disciplines like art and theory, or digital media art and media studies, and transgender studies, and critical race theory, and decolonial theory. Maybe that's a long list, but I feel like like what I said before about listening is really important to me. I know we're wrapping up. And I feel like art and theory are long conversations that happen over thousands of years, and you gotta know what's been said. And part of how I understand what's been said is by situating it within genres or disciplines. So part of being interdisciplinary to me does mean knowing about more than one discipline. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Hex, for being our conversation tender. Thank you, Percy and Misha, for all your stories and sharing your experiences and advice. Thank you, everyone, for being here. For Whitney for wrangling the tech and also audience questions, and Maddie in the classroom also wrangling student questions. So thank you all so much. I feel really full, like I've been like having a really great meal here. Just listen, I love listening to everything, and I hope everyone had a really wonderful time with us, and hopefully we'll see you again. And this talk will be available later on from the Simpson Center. So thank you all so much.